Go now! Get to the transport!
Yes, sir, moving out!
Faster! They're right behind us!
Copy on the move!
At 2:14 in the morning on the 14th day of October 2012, a Black Hawk helicopter called Vanguard 7 was dying over the Kunar Valley in eastern Afghanistan. The RPG came out of the dark without warning. No sound before it. No flash on the ridgeline. Just a streak of white light that crossed the night sky in less than a second, and then the world came apart at the tail section with a sound that was less like an explosion and more like something fundamental being revoked. The helicopter lurched left, hard. The kind of movement that throws a human body sideways without asking permission. Inside the cabin, red warning lights flooded everything. The air filled with smoke and the sharp chemical smell of burning insulation. Alarms screamed over the headsets. The aircraft shuddered from its nose to what remained of its tail rotor, a deep mechanical shudder, the kind a machine makes when it has been mortally wounded and is only beginning to understand what that means. Senior Chief Marcus Wren grabbed the overhead handle with both hands and looked across the cabin through the red haze. His voice cut through the chaos the way only a voice shaped by 20 years of bad situations can cut through chaos. Flat, certain, like a man reading from a manual. Can anyone fly this thing? Silence. Not the silence of empty space. The silence of 7 people in a burning aircraft looking at each other and finding nothing useful in any of those faces. And then, in the back of the cabin, something moved. A figure stood up slowly, not fast, not dramatic, just slowly the way a person rises when they have already made a decision and are simply letting their body catch up to it. The red light caught her face. Kara Holt, Petty Officer First Class, 28 years old. The medic nobody had looked at twice since Wheels Up 3 hours ago. She did not speak. She simply moved toward the cockpit with her hand pressed against the wall for balance, and her right leg dragging just slightly with each step the way it always did, the way it had dragged for 3 years, the way she had learned to carry without comment. Wren stared at her. The alarms kept screaming, and the helicopter kept falling. 8 hours earlier, the briefing room at Bagram Airfield smelled the way all briefing rooms in Afghanistan smelled in those years. Dust and diesel and burned coffee and the dry cold that comes from air conditioning, working too hard in a place never meant to be air-conditioned. A fluorescent light in the far corner buzzed with a frequency that sat just below the threshold of annoyance and never quite crossed it. Kara Holt sat in the back row. She always sat in the back row, not because she was hiding, though some part of her had been hiding for 3 years. She sat there because the back row was where attached personnel sat. Augmentees. Specialists brought in to fill a gap for one mission, one rotation, one problem that the team could not solve internally. She was the gap this time. The team had lost their primary medic to a broken ankle 2 weeks before, a non-combat injury that carried its own particular embarrassment in that community, and she had been pulled from the aid station and dropped into this briefing room with 12 hours notice and a duffel bag that still smelled like the last FOB she had been assigned to. She did not know these men. They did not know her. That was fine. That was how she preferred it. She watched Commander Evan Driscoll brief the mission from the front of the room, his pointer moving across the satellite image with the practiced economy that distinguished men who had done this many times from men who were doing it for the first few. Driscoll was somewhere in his early 40s. He had the face of a man who had spent a long time outdoors in difficult weather and had simply accepted, or he wasted movement, no performance. He spoke the way the best officers speak, which is to say he said exactly what needed to be said and then stopped talking. The target was a compound in the Kunar Valley. A CIA asset had been operating in the region for 14 months. Intelligence had placed him inside a specific structure in a specific village at a specific grid coordinate. The asset's cover had been degraded. Enemy forces were moving toward his position. The window to extract him was narrowing by the hour. 15 minutes on the ground. In and out. Light resistance expected. Kara had been doing this long enough to know what those words were worth. She opened her medical kit on her lap and went through it for the 3rd time that afternoon. Not because she had forgotten anything. She went through it because the inventory of a medical kit is a kind of prayer when you are about to go somewhere that will require you to use it. A tourniquet, 2 chest seals, hemostatic gauze, IV supplies, a surgical airway kit, morphine drawn up and ready. She knew exactly where each item lived in that bag. She could find any of them in the dark. With her hands shaking while someone was screaming at her, she had done exactly that, more than once. Across the room, Marcus Wren sat with his arms crossed and his eyes on the mission map, And once, only once, he glanced back at her the way a man glances at something he is not sure belongs in the room. Not hostile, not welcoming, simply assessing. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second and then returned to her kit. She understood the dynamic. These men were a team in the truest sense of the word, built over years of shared suffering and shared training and shared near death. She was a temporary attachment. She would do her job. They would do theirs. At the end of the mission, she would go back to the aid station and they would go back to whatever came next for them. That was the arrangement. She was comfortable with the arrangement. Near the door, the two pilots stood together with their own maps and their own conversation. Chief Warrant Officer Sam Garrett was the aircraft commander, tall and broad, with a graying beard that violated regulations in the specific way that suggested no one had ever thought it worth the argument. His co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Jake Prentice, was younger, sharp-featured, the kind of pilot who could talk about fuel burn and rotor wash with the same enthusiasm other men reserved for things they actually loved. Kara watched them for a moment. She had not been near a helicopter cockpit in 3 years. She looked away. The memory of her father came to her the way his memories always came, without invitation, through a door she had never successfully locked. She had been 17 years old. A Saturday morning in September, and the air at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia was still carrying the last of summer, that particular September warmth that knows it is borrowed time. Her father, Colonel Reed Holt, had just returned from a deployment exercise and was still wearing his flight suit, which smelled like the inside of a cockpit, which Kara had always thought smelled like metal and purpose. He had taken her out to the flight line. He sat her in the cockpit of a trainer aircraft and put his hands over hers on the stick and talked to her for 40 minutes about what it meant to feel an aircraft. Not just fly it, feel it through your hands and your feet and the way the seat pushes back against you when you change altitude. A plane talks to you, Kara, he had said, not loudly, the way he talked to her when no one else was listening. Every aircraft has its own voice. You just have to learn to be quiet enough to hear it. She had not known then that she would spend the next 11 years learning exactly what he meant. She had gone to college on an ROTC scholarship. She had applied for flight school. She had graduated in the top 8% of her class at Fort Rucker, Alabama, on a morning in June when the red clay of the airfield was cracked and dry under the rotor wash. Her father had driven 9 hours from Virginia to be there. He had shaken her hand in front of the assembled graduates. Her hand inside both of his, the only moment of public sentiment he had ever permitted himself in her presence. She had been an Apache pilot for 2 years when everything changed. She did not let herself think past that point. Not in briefing rooms, not before missions. That particular door had a particular lock, and tonight she needed the lock to hold. She closed her medical kit. The briefing was ending. The flight out was smooth for the first 40 minutes. Kara sat in the forward left seat of the cabin, her back to the fuselage, her medical kit in her lap, and her feet flat on the floor. The SEALs occupied the remaining seats in configurations they had clearly used hundreds of times before, each man in his position. Each weapon staged the way each man had decided to stage it, the whole arrangement carrying the efficiency of people who have practiced until the practice became invisible. Ren sat across from her. He was running through something in his head, his jaw working slightly, his eyes focused on nothing. Not daydreaming, rehearsing. Walking through the mission in his mind, every step, every contingency, every decision he might need to make before his body had time to think. Driscoll sat nearest the cockpit door with his head tipped back and his eyes closed. But his hands were still in his lap, fingers loosely curled around the grip of his rifle. And Kara suspected he had not been fully asleep since sometime in the previous month. The intercom crackled. 5 minutes, Garrett's voice from the cockpit. Steady, professional. Kara felt the change in the aircraft as it began its descent, a slight nose-down attitude. The sound of the rotors shifting as power was adjusted. She had felt this 1,000 times from the left seat of an Apache cockpit. Feeling it from a passenger seat in the cabin was a different experience entirely. Like knowing a song by heart, but hearing someone else play it. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She had learned over the years not to dismiss that sensation. It was not supernatural. It was simply the body's way of processing information that the conscious mind had not yet organized into a coherent signal. Something was wrong. She did not know what. The radio erupted. LZ is hot! LZ is hot! Prentice, from the cockpit. His voice carrying exactly the right amount of urgency and not a single syllable more. The RPG came from the eastern ridgeline. The explosion at the tail section was a physical thing, not just a sound, but a pressure wave that moved through the airframe and through the seats and through the bodies of everyone seated inside. The helicopter yawed violently left. Warning lights flooded the cabin in red. The alarms went from 0 to everything in under 2 seconds. Taking fire from multiple positions. Garrett's voice strained now, something different in it, but his hands on the controls, always his hands on the controls. I'm going to get us down. 30 seconds. I can get us 30 seconds. More fire from the ridgeline, tracers cutting across the sky in long orange lines. The helicopter shuddered, metal sounds from the tail section that did not belong there. Brace, Garrett said. Brace, brace. The Black Hawk hit the rocky ground at an angle that was not quite survivable, and then through some combination of skill and physics in whatever Garrett was doing with the collective in the last 3 seconds, became survivable. The impact threw Kara sideways. Her helmet met the bulkhead. Stars, white noise. Then the sound of tearing metal and the hiss of something hydraulic letting go, and then after all of that, an impossible silence. 3 seconds of absolute silence. Out, Driscoll ordered. Everyone out. Secure a perimeter. The SEALs moved like water. Kara grabbed her kit and followed her right leg, protesting the way it always protested when she asked too much of it too fast. And then she was outside, and the night air of the Kunar Valley was cold and smelled like smoke and cordite and the particular alkaline dust of eastern Afghanistan. The helicopter was still there. Most of it. The tail section was destroyed. Fuel was finding its way across the ground in thin dark lines that caught the light wrong. Someone was missing. Kara counted. Garrett. She turned back toward the cockpit. Through the cracked windscreen, she could see him slumped forward against his harness. She climbed back into the wreck, moving over debris that groaned under her weight, and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. Nothing. She checked again. The way you check when you already know the answer but owe it to the person to make sure. Nothing. She moved her hand to his chest and found the entry wound through the flight suit. Shrapnel. Not from the crash, from the initial RPG strike. He had taken it in the first moments, and he had sat in that cockpit and flown this aircraft and put it down in a place where the people behind him could survive, and he had been dead or very close to it for the last 30 seconds of that flight. She closed his eyes. She gave herself 3 seconds, no more. 3 seconds was what she allowed. Then she moved to Prentice. He was breathing. The gash across his forehead was deep and bleeding heavily, and his pupils, when she checked them with her light, were wrong, one of them. The kind of wrong that means pressure on the brain. The kind of wrong that has a timeline attached to it. I need help with the co-pilot, she called. Wren appeared. Together they extracted Prentice from the cockpit and got him clear of the airframe before the first ground fire started pinging off the fuselage from the eastern approach. Kara got Prentice behind a large rock outcropping and assessed him while the firefight opened up around her. Driscoll appeared beside her, crouching low. His face was covered in dust, and there was a cut above his left ear that he appeared to be completely unaware of. How is he critical? She kept her voice even. He needs a trauma center, not a field medic. Driscoll looked back at the smoking helicopter and then at the ridgeline surrounding them. Nearest friendlies are in the valley. He keyed his radio. Vanguard 7T OC. Bird is down. Pilot KIA. Co-pilot critical. Need immediate QRF and air support. The response came back through static. QRF spinning up. ET, A3 hours. Apache's inbound 45 minutes. Can you hold? Driscoll walked back to the helicopter and looked into the cockpit for a long moment at Garrett's hands still resting on the controls at the instrument panel, still showing warnings that no longer mattered for Sam Garrett, but still mattered very much for the people standing outside. He turned back to the team. Anyone here know how to fly this aircraft? The silence that followed was different from the post-crash silence. That silence had been shock. This silence was inventory. Every man running through his qualifications and finding the same gap in the same place. These were men who could do things most people did not believe were possible. They could move through water and darkness in hostile terrain without making a sound. They could put a rifle round on a target at distances that required a different relationship with physics than most people ever develop. They could navigate, survive, fight, lead, adapt. But flying a helicopter required something specific. Something measured in hundreds of hours and certifications and a particular kind of muscle memory that you either had or you did not. Wren shook his head slowly. Even if the co-pilot wasn't out, that bird is held together with good intentions. The tail rotor is destroyed. Kara was standing at the edge of the group. She had been doing something she had not done in 3 years, which was look at a helicopter cockpit and feel the thing her father had been talking about on that airfield in Virginia. The thing that was not rational and was not in any manual. The thing that told her the aircraft was damaged but not dead, that it wanted to fly, that it was still talking in the way all aircraft talk to anyone quiet enough to hear. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, or not only from fear. She had sworn an oath to herself 3 years ago, in a hospital bed in Germany, with her right leg in an external fixator and the faces of 2 dead children living behind her eyes every time she closed them. She had sworn she would never sit in a cockpit again, that the decision she had made over Helmand Province had cost enough, that the only responsible thing left to do was to remove herself from any situation where a decision like that could be required of her again. She had kept that oath. She had been keeping it for 3 years. She looked at Prentice unconscious behind the rock, bleeding into the brain tissue that was keeping him alive. She looked at the SEALs forming a perimeter against an enemy that was getting closer by the minute. She looked at the helicopter. She stood up. Every head in the group turned toward her. Ren's expression moved through several things in rapid succession. Surprise, confusion, a reassessment of something he thought he had already assessed. "You're a medic," he said. "The way you say something when you are trying to make sense of information that does not fit the category you have built for it." "I was a pilot," Kara said quietly, "before I was a medic." She moved toward the helicopter. Muscle memory was already doing things her conscious mind was only partially authorizing. She was calculating rotor damage, hydraulic pressure, fuel state transmission temperature. The numbers were not good. She had worked with worse numbers than this exactly once, and that had not ended well. "Before," Ren said, following her. "What does that mean before?" She stopped with her hand on the cockpit doorframe. She had 2 options. She could give him the short version, the version that would get her into the seat faster and maybe keep them alive. Or she could tell him the truth, which would take longer and might result in him pulling her away from the controls before she ever touched them, but which was the only thing she had left that she was certain she still owned. She chose the truth. She turned to face him. 3 years ago, I was flying Apache helicopters for the Army. I had 1,200 flight hours. In the spring of 2009, I was leading a 2-ship formation providing close air support for a ground unit in Helmand Province. She kept her voice level. "The transmission in my aircraft failed at about 400 feet. My co-pilot told me we were not going to make it to the airfield. I had a choice. I could put the aircraft down in the open desert 3 miles from any cover, or I could set it down near a village. Close enough for cover, far enough to avoid civilian structures, I thought." She paused. "The transmission failed completely at 200 feet. I lost directional control. The aircraft came down through the outer wall of a home where a family was sheltering from the fighting." She did not look away from him. "2 children died. A woman lost the use of her legs. My co-pilot, Lieutenant Sarah Mercer, suffered a spinal injury." She touched the side of her right leg, not dramatically, just a brief acknowledgement. "I have walked with this since the crash." The sound of gunfire in the distance was getting louder, getting closer. "The investigation cleared me," she continued. "Mechanical failure, unavoidable, split-second decision under combat conditions. That is what the report said." She paused. "I could not clear myself. I transferred to medicine. I swore I would not fly again." Ren looked at her, the kind of look that takes the full measure of a person. "So," he said finally, "can you fly this helicopter or not?" "Technically, yes. My qualifications have not been formally revoked. The aircraft type is within my experience. The systems are damaged, but some of them are still functional." She held his gaze. "Will I freeze up over an operational decision? Will I make another call that gets people killed? I genuinely do not know. I have not been in a cockpit in 3 years. And I am standing here telling you this instead of just getting in the seat, because if you are going to trust me with your life, you deserve to know what you are trusting." Ren was quiet for 4 seconds. She counted. Then something shifted in his face. Not softness, exactly. Men like Ren did not carry softness as a primary feature. It was more like recognition. The look of a man who has met a version of this situation before in a different form and knows what it actually means. "I have worked with pilots who were certain about everything," he said. "Some of them are buried at Arlington." He looked at the helicopter, then back at her. "Broken things can still cut Holt. Get into the seat." Driscoll had been listening. He looked at Kara for exactly the amount of time it took him to make a decision he could commit to fully. "Ren, get everyone loaded." He turned to Kara. "If you say we can fly, we fly." He paused. "Can we?" Kara climbed into the pilot's seat. The instrument panel was a disaster. Warning lights across every system. Hydraulic pressure in the danger zone. Transmission temperature climbing. Fuel gauge showing critically low. The tail rotor would give them something, but not what it would have given them before the RPG took most of it apart. She put both hands on the controls. They felt like something she had put down in a room 3 years ago and then moved furniture in front of and told herself she had forgotten where the room was. But her hands remembered. Her feet found the pedals without searching. Her body remembered the geometry of the seat and the overhead panel, and the cyclic and the collective and all the relationships between them. The helicopter was talking. She was quiet enough now to hear it. She looked back at Driscoll, at Wren, at the men who were looking at her with the quality of attention that people offer when their survival is attached to what happens next. She lied. Not entirely. Mostly she made a calculation that 50% odds were better than 0% odds, and she called it yes. Yes, she said, we can fly. Because sometimes the only difference between courage and insanity is whether you succeed. And Kara Holt had not yet decided which one this was. Wren secured the cabin. Driscoll took the right seat, the seat where Sam Garrett had died, and did not hesitate, despite the blood still wet on the armrest. Kara pointed to the radio panel and told him what she needed from him. Then she began the pre-flight checks with hands that moved faster than her fear and slower than she would have liked. The engines coughed, sputtered, then caught with a sound like something damaged deciding to try anyway, and the rotor began to turn above them, and the warning lights blazed red across every inch of the panel, and the helicopter shook like something that had already been through too much and was being asked to go through more. Kara wrapped her hands around the controls. She thought of her father sitting beside her in a trainer aircraft on a September morning, 21 years ago, his hands over hers telling her to be quiet enough to hear what the aircraft was saying. She was listening. "Here we go," she said, and she pulled the collective. The Black Hawk left the ground the way wounded things sometimes do not, with confidence, not with the smooth authority of a healthy aircraft at full power, but with a kind of stubborn insistence. A refusal that was almost biological, as if the machine itself had decided that dying on the ground in the Kunar Valley was not an acceptable conclusion to the evening. Kara felt the shudder move through the airframe the moment the skids cleared the rocks. Not a small shudder, the kind that means several things are already failing, and the question is only which one fails first and what happens when it does. She held the cyclic with both hands and kept her feet light on the pedals and listened. The tail rotor was giving her something. Not what it should give. Maybe 30% of its normal authority, which meant the aircraft wanted to rotate slowly to the right, constantly, and her left pedal was having an ongoing argument with that tendency, and for the moment the argument was close enough to a draw that they were flying in approximately a straight line. Approximately. "Altitude 50 feet, Driscoll said from the right seat, reading the instruments the way she had instructed him. "Airspeed 30 knots. Too slow." Kara pushed the cyclic forward, dropping the nose to trade altitude for airspeed, feeling the aircraft respond with the reluctance of something operating at the edge of its limits. "If I push harder, the transmission overheats faster. If I do not push harder, we are a slow target at low altitude." "What is the solution?" "There is not one. We fly the middle and hope." A tracer round came from somewhere below and to the left, close enough that the light of it filled the cockpit for a fraction of a second. The enemy on the ridgelines had not stopped firing simply because the helicopter had gotten airborne. They were tracking the aircraft with the patience of people who had been doing this for a long time. From the cabin behind her, one of the SEALs called out, "Taking fire from the ground. Permission to return fire." "Negative." Kara did not raise her voice. "We are too unstable. Any significant weight shift, and I lose what is left of my control authority. Everyone stays exactly where they are." A pause from the cabin, then Wren's voice, "Roger." The hydraulic pressure gauge dropped another increment on its dial. She watched it the way you watch something that is going to run out and cannot be refilled, with the attention of someone doing continuous arithmetic in their head, calculating how much is left against how much is needed against how far they still have to go. The numbers were not encouraging. "Talk to me about the hydraulics," Driscoll said. "They control the flight surfaces. They make the controls quiet enough for a human being to move. Without them, the cyclic and collective become extremely heavy. I can still fly, but it costs more. More strength, more effort, more fatigue, more delay between input and response. And when they are gone completely, well, then we have a different kind of flight experience." Driscoll absorbed this. "Fuel. The leak from the tail section is worse than I thought. Consumption is roughly double what it should be. We have somewhere between 15 and 18 minutes before we are flying on whatever momentum we have built up." She heard him doing the same arithmetic she had already done. "We cannot reach the friendly position in the valley," he said. "No." "What can we reach?" Kara scanned the terrain below through the cracked windscreen. The Kunar Valley at night was a geography of dark ridgelines and darker valleys, and the occasional cluster of lights that indicated human habitation, which in this part of the world meant structures, which meant cover, which meant a fighting chance if you could get to it. There is a village approximately 8 miles north, she said. Driscoll, your map. He pulled up the tactical display. Curran, intel has it as contested. Taliban presence in the district, but locals have maintained contact with coalition forces. Unknown current posture. Unknown is better than definitely hostile. Kara adjusted their heading 2 degrees. Beyond the village, there is open terrain for approximately 3 miles. Beyond that, the valley that leads toward friendly positions. We do not have the fuel to reach the valley. We can reach the village. If we set down in the village and it is hostile, we are done. If we set down in open desert with no cover, we are also done. We are just done in a flatter location. She checked the fuel gauge, 13 minutes optimistically. We go for the village. Driscoll folded the map and put it away. Then we go for the village. The transmission warning buzzer sounded, not the low hum of a system requesting attention. The sharp, continuous tone of a system declaring an emergency. Kara's eyes went to the temperature gauge. The needle was in a range that had red hash marks beside it for a reason. What was that? Wren's voice from behind her. Transmission temperature, it is climbing. What does that mean in plain English? It means the gearbox that connects the engines to the rotor is getting hot enough to fail. If it fails, we stop flying immediately and permanently. How long? Kara listened to the sounds of the aircraft with the full attention she had developed over years of flying machines that were trying to communicate their condition through vibration and pitch, and the qualities of stress that metal makes when it is being asked to perform beyond its design tolerances. She had learned to read those sounds the way other people learn to read faces. 8 minutes, she said, maybe 10. The cabin behind her went quiet in the way that soldiers go quiet when the arithmetic of a situation has become too clear to require discussion. She flew. The ridgelines of the Kunar Valley moved beneath them, dark and ancient, and completely indifferent to the small drama of the dying helicopter working its way north. The moon was 3/4 full, and it laid its light across the terrain in a way that was almost beautiful. If you were in a condition to notice beauty, which Kara was not, quite, but which some background register of her mind noted anyway. The way a person notices weather when they are driving in an emergency. She had been flying for 11 minutes when it happened. The helicopter yawed, not dramatically. Just a slight drift to the right that was a degree or two more than the normal drift she had been continuously correcting. And the rocks below them shifted their angle relative to the aircraft in a way that sent a signal from her hands through her arms and directly into the part of her brain responsible for recognizing specific dangers. It was not the Kunar Valley below her. It was Helmand Province, spring of 2009. The aircraft under her hands was not this Black Hawk. It was her Apache, and the transmission temperature was where it should not be. And her co-pilot, Sarah Mercer, was in the right seat calling out numbers in a voice that was professional and controlled, and underneath the professionalism was something Kara had recognized because she was feeling it herself. The memory did not arrive gently. It arrived the way memories arrive when they have been locked in a room for 3 years and have spent that time accumulating pressure against the door, all at once, complete. She had been leading a 2-ship formation at 4,000 feet on a clear morning, working a grid in support of a ground element that had been in contact for 40 minutes. The engagement was going well by the standards of that kind of work, and then the transmission warning light came on. Not a flutter, not a momentary false reading, the solid, unwavering illumination of a system that has decided to stop working. Sarah Mercer had read the checklist. They had run through every response the manual specified. None of it changed the fundamental arithmetic. They were a helicopter with a failing transmission at 4,000 feet over terrain that did not offer many options. We are not going to make it to the airfield, Sarah said, not panicking, stating a fact. Kara had looked at the terrain, desert to the south, open and flat, and 3 miles from any cover or structure. The village to the north, a cluster of mud brick buildings in a valley. She made her calculation. The open desert meant sitting exposed in flat terrain with no cover while they waited for a recovery team. The village meant cover. It meant proximity to people who might help. It meant a defensible position if the aircraft came down cleanly on the open ground at the village perimeter. She chose the village. The transmission failed completely at 200 feet. What happened after that was not a decision. It was physics. The aircraft began to rotate. She fought it. both feet on the pedals, both hands on the controls, fighting the tendency of the dying machine to spin toward the right, to spiral, to convert altitude into rotation in exactly the way that killed people. She managed to keep it from spinning completely. She managed to control the rate of descent to something that was not quite compatible with survival, but was not quite incompatible with it either. She did not manage to control the trajectory. The Apache came down through the outer wall of a single-story home at the edge of the village. The wall was mud brick 2 feet thick, and it did not slow the aircraft meaningfully. The aircraft went through it and came to rest partly inside the structure and partly in the small courtyard beyond it, and the rotor came apart, and then there was the silence and the dust and the sound of Sarah Mercer's breathing, which was the most important sound in the world for approximately 8 seconds until Kara heard the other sounds. The sounds that she still heard 3 years later in the particular quality of silence that follows an emergency. The rotor wash from the Black Hawk's damaged tail pulled the aircraft slightly right, and Kara's hands corrected, and the correction pulled her back into the present the way a hand on the shoulder pulls someone standing too close to a ledge. "Where did you go?" Driscoll's voice. From the right seat, calm, specific. Kara blinked. The instrument panel was in front of her. The Kunar Valley was below her. The altitude read 110 feet, and the airspeed was 70 knots, and the hydraulic pressure was 6 points lower than it had been 60 seconds ago. "Checking systems," she said. Driscoll looked at her for 2 seconds. He did not press it. He was a man who understood the difference between information he needed right now and information he needed eventually. She flew the aircraft. She made the corrections. She kept the tail rotor in its argument with the aircraft's tendency to rotate, and she kept the transmission temperature from pegging its gauge by managing power with a continuous series of small adjustments that were less flying and more negotiating with something that had already decided it was finished and was only continuing out of stubbornness. The fuel gauge reached the red arc at the same moment the transmission warning changed its tone. "Those sounds," Wren said from behind her. "Both of them, what do they mean?" "The fuel is at critical level. We have somewhere between 5 and 8 minutes before the engines stop receiving fuel." She did not turn around. "The transmission sound means the bearing in the tail rotor assembly is coming apart. When it goes, we begin to rotate. At this altitude and speed, I would have approximately 5 seconds to initiate an auto-rotation before the rotation becomes unrecoverable. 5 seconds. If I execute it correctly, and if you do not execute it correctly, then I execute it incorrectly." She heard Wren exhale, not with fear exactly, the exhale of a man who had received an honest accounting and was proceeding with it. "Village ahead," he said. "I can see lights, 2 miles. Kara saw it, a scattering of lights in the darkness below the particular pattern that indicates structures grouped together. A village of perhaps 30 or 40 buildings clustered along a route that probably followed water or trade or both. Beyond it, the open terrain Driscoll had described. 3 miles of relative flatness before the valley that led to friendly positions she did not have the fuel to reach. The tail rotor bearing made a sound like a single sharp note struck on something metallic. The helicopter began to turn, not dramatically, an inch at a time. But Kara felt it through the pedals and through the cyclic and through the conversation that exists between a pilot and an aircraft when both of them know something critical has changed. She held it, both feet active on the pedals. The correction was consuming more effort than it should, which meant the bearing was degrading faster than her estimate, which meant the remaining arithmetic was being revised in real time. "Fuel gauge is at the limit," Driscoll said. "I see it." The fuel warning light turned from blinking to solid. Solid meaning the calculation was over. Whatever was in the tanks now was all there would ever be. "Everyone brace," Kara said. "This is going to be a hard approach." She pushed the nose down and traded altitude for the last miles of distance with the specific calculation of a person spending the last of something they cannot replenish. The village came toward them. She could see rooftops now, flat mud brick rooftops in the moonlight. And beyond them, the open ground she had been aiming for a clearing of perhaps 300 meters just past the last buildings. The tail rotor bearing made the sound again louder this time, and the aircraft yawed right hard enough that the turn rate exceeded what her left pedal could correct for. She stomped the pedal. The aircraft responded slower than it should, the way a car responds to steering when the tires are losing contact with the road. "We are spinning," Driscoll said. "I know. Can you stop it?" "Working on it." She reduced power and dropped the collective, simultaneously changing the relationship between the main rotor and the tail rotor in a way that bought her back perhaps 40% of her directional control, which was not what she needed, but was what she had. The spinning slowed, did not stop. Slowed. The clearing was 200 meters ahead and below them. The engines coughed once together, the synchronized cough of two fuel-starved turbines telling her the tanks had given everything they were going to give. And then the gauges told her something different. Kara stared at the fuel gauge. The needle was pegged at empty. But beneath her feet, through the pedals, through the seat, through the conversation between a pilot and an aircraft, she felt something the gauge was not showing her. The engines were running. Not well, not reliably, but running. She looked at the gauge again. The glass over the face of it was cracked in the lower left corner, a crack that ran directly beneath the needle's resting position. A crack that could, under certain conditions of vibration and impact, create enough friction to hold the needle in a position that did not accurately reflect the fuel state. The gauge was broken, not empty. Broken. Driscoll. Her voice was level. The fuel gauge needle is stuck. Mechanical fault from the crash. We still have fuel. He looked at the gauge. At the crack in the glass, how much? Enough that the engines are still running. Enough that we are not gliding. She scanned the terrain below. We can still set down in that clearing, but we should. The tail rotor is about to fail completely, and the clearing is defensible enough. She brought the Black Hawk down with what she had left. The skids hit twice, bounced, hit a third time with a force that went through the airframe and through the seats and through the bodies of everyone in the aircraft, and then settled into the rocky ground with the finality of something that has used everything it had and is now finished moving. The engines ran for 4 more seconds after touchdown and then stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that follows the cessation of all mechanical noise in a place where that noise has been the primary fact of your existence for the last 15 minutes. Everyone check in, Driscoll said. The SEALs checked in, one by one. Minor injuries, nothing that stopped anyone from functioning. Kara sat with her hands still on the controls, staring at the instrument panel. The rotors were winding down above her. The night air was coming in through the bullet holes in the fuselage, cold and thin and smelling like dust and distance. She had put the aircraft down. They were alive. All of them. Wren appeared at the cockpit door, crouching to look in at her. His expression had changed from the one he had been carrying in the cabin. Good flying, he said. We need to move, she said. This position is a kill box, high ground on 3 sides. They tracked us the whole way. They will have people here in 20 minutes. Wren straightened up and looked at the terrain. She watched him reach the same conclusion she had already reached. The village, he said. The village is 8 miles. We still have fuel. If we take off now, we can cover 8 miles in 4 minutes. We set down near the village, we have cover. We have structures. We possibly have local support. We wait here. We are inside a bowl with fighters closing in from 3 directions. Driscoll appeared at her other side, having come around the nose of the aircraft. He looked at the terrain. He looked at the helicopter. He looked at Kara. The tail rotor. It is damaged, not destroyed. When it sees the rotation stop, but the mechanism is still present. I can feel input through the pedals. One more flight, that is all it has. But one more flight might be all we need. If it goes while we are airborne, then I auto-rotate and we crash instead of flying. Same outcome as staying here, except we get 8 miles closer to something better first. Boo, Driscoll was quiet for 5 seconds. Then he raised his voice to the team. Everyone get back in the aircraft. We are flying. The protest from the cabin was brief and human, and then over. The SEALs loaded back in, the engines restarted, the rotor turned, the warning lights blazed exactly as they had blazed before, and the tail rotor made the sound the tail rotor now always made, and the aircraft shook with the vibration of something being asked to do more than it should be able to do. She pulled the collective. The Black Hawk climbed, slower this time, less margin in everything, but it climbed and it flew north toward the lights of the village of Karan at a speed that was faster than safe for the aircraft's condition and slower than she would have liked, and she held it together with the full attention of everything she had, every hour of training and experience and muscle memory that she had spent 3 years trying to forget. 4 minutes later, the village was below them. The tail rotor bearing let go completely on the approach. The aircraft began to spin, not slowly this time, but a committed rotation that loaded everyone inside with centrifugal force and turned the ground below into a rotating plane that made distance and direction meaningless. Kara did not think. She had practiced this 100 times. Auto-rotation. When the engine fails or the tail rotor fails, you use the falling motion of the aircraft to keep the main rotor turning. And you time the flare at the bottom precisely, and you trade the energy stored in the spinning rotor for one last moment of lift at exactly the right height, and if you do it correctly, you walk away. Collective all the way down. Let the aircraft fall. The ground came up through the spinning windscreen in a rotating smear of moonlit terrain. She counted rotations. She felt the rotor speed through her hands on the collective. She waited for the moment that training had made into instinct and instinct had made into reflex. There. She pulled the collective to maximum. The rotor bit into the air with the full authority of its stored energy. The spin continued but slowed dramatically, and the aircraft's vertical speed dropped from fatal to survivable in approximately the same second that the skids made contact with the ground at the edge of a cleared area 200 meters past the last building of the village of Karan. The impact was hard, very hard. The airframe buckled at the left rear corner. Something in the landing gear gave way. The aircraft tilted right, and for 4 full seconds, Kara was certain it was going to roll. It did not roll. It settled. Upright, badly damaged, finished, but upright. The rotor wound down. The engine stopped. Silence arrived again, different from the last, silence deeper, with more weight behind it. Then Ren said from somewhere in the cabin behind her, "If anyone wants to criticize the landing, I would like to point out that we are alive and on the ground, and those two facts should take priority in the discussion." A voice from the back, "I think I left my stomach somewhere over the valley. You will find it later. Check your weapons and get out." The village of Karan at night was quiet in the way that villages go quiet when they have heard something frightening and are waiting to understand what it means. The buildings were close together, low mud brick, their flat roofs catching the moonlight in pale horizontal lines. A dog was barking somewhere in the middle of the village. Lights were appearing in doorways, then disappearing again. The SEALs had established a perimeter in the first 30 seconds. Weapons-ready positions, taken sectors covered with the automatic efficiency of people for whom this specific transition from moving to stationary defensive posture required no discussion. Driscoll was on the radio calling in their position. QRF inbound. Apache support available. ETA 60 minutes. 60 minutes was a long time. The figure who walked out of the village toward them moved in the way of a man who understood that the people watching him had weapons and was coming out anyway because the situation required it. An old man, 70 or close to it. He wore traditional dress, a pakol hat pushed back on his head, and moved with the deliberateness of someone who has survived enough difficult nights to have stopped being surprised by them. He stopped 15 feet from Driscoll and spoke in Pashto. Driscoll had enough of the language to work with. The conversation was short. Kara watched the old man's face while it happened, the way his eyes moved across the helicopter, across the SEALs, across her, across the injured Prentice, being carried by 2 of the team. His name was Fareed Nasri. He was the village elder. He had been dealing with Taliban pressure for 2 years. His son had been taken 14 months ago. His brother's house had been burned the previous spring. He invited them in. He knows what it can, as Driscoll said quietly to Kara as they moved toward the village. He is doing it anyway. Why, booyah. He says if the Taliban come here, they come whether we are here or not. Better to have people who can fight. The next 40 minutes were the organized chaos of a defensive position being established under time pressure. The SEALs took positions on the village perimeter using the mud brick walls for cover. Several of Fareed Nasri's men joined them, older rifles. Serious faces, the calm that belongs to people who have been at war long enough that it has simply become the weather they live in. Kara worked on Prentice in a room that Fareed Nasri's family had cleared for her. 2 oil lamps, a sleeping mat on a stone floor. She had what she had, which was not enough for what he needed, but was enough to keep him stable through the next hour if nothing changed. The first shots came from the eastern approach 20 minutes after they landed, not probing fire. The coordinated fire of a force that had tracked the helicopter, calculated its likely landing zone, and moved to engage with the unhurried efficiency of fighters who know the terrain and own the darkness. The SEALs returned fire. Kara heard the firefight through the walls, the rhythm of it, the way it moved from single shots to sustained bursts, and back the way the sound changed when the fire was coming from different distances and directions. She kept working on Prentice. Driscoll appeared in the doorway. "Ren is on the east wall. We have got at least 15 fighters in the lower approach, more moving from the north. Apaches are 40 minutes out." 40 minutes. "We hold 40 minutes, we are fine." Driscoll left. The firefight intensified. She heard the crack of an RPG launching from somewhere east, and then the detonation against the outer wall of the compound, close enough that dust fell from the ceiling of the room, and the oil lamps flickered. She kept her hands on her patient. 15 minutes into the firefight, Ren went down. She heard it in the way you hear things that change the shape of a situation, a different kind of noise in the eastern sector. She was already moving with her kit before Driscoll's voice came through the door. Halt! Wren! East wall. She went through the doorway and she found Wren at the base of the eastern wall in the shadow between two mud brick pillars, with his hand pressed to his chest and his face showing the compression that means pain is being managed and not yet winning. The round had caught him through the right side of his plate carrier. The plate had stopped the bullet, but the force of a rifle round stopped by a ceramic plate traveled somewhere, and where it had traveled was into Wren's chest, into ribs, into the soft architecture behind them. She got her hands on him and assessed. Right side, 3 ribs at minimum fractured. The breathing was labored but present. Not a pneumothorax, not yet, but the potential was there. Internal bleeding was a question she could not fully answer in a dark courtyard with gunfire coming over the wall above her. But his pressure was dropping, and his pulse was climbing, and those two facts together told a story she did not need laboratory confirmation to understand. This is bad, she said, because Wren was not a man who benefited from being handled gently with information. Define bad. Surgery bad, hospital bad, but not right now bad. Not for the next 20 minutes if you stay still. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was still strong, which was something. You flew us here. He was breathing in the careful pattern of someone managing pain by managing breath. Do not let the ghosts win. She looked at him, at the face of the man who had been the first person in 3 years to offer her a version of herself that was not the thing she had done in Helmand, but the thing she was capable of doing anywhere. I will not, she said. She got him stabilized and left 2 of the village men with him, with instructions delivered through Farid Nasri's translation. Then she moved back to Prentice. 10 minutes later, the Apaches arrived. The sound of them was one of the finest sounds Kara had ever heard. The heavy thump of attack helicopters in the dark. The chain guns beginning their work. The Taliban fire from the eastern approach going suddenly erratic and then mostly silent. 2 passes. 3. The perimeter held by the SEALs and Farid Nasri's men had cost the attacking force enough that the air support finished the conversation. The Chinook came in 15 minutes after the Apaches. Heavy, deliberate, its rotors throwing rotor wash across the entire village as it flared into a cleared area on the village's southern edge. American medics came off the ramp at a run. Prentice went first on a litter, 2 medics working on him as they moved. Then 2 of the SEALs with injuries that had been managed but needed attention. Then Wren, on a litter he had agreed to only after being informed by Kara that the alternative was she would decline to stabilize his chest further, and he could see how that worked out. Driscoll appeared beside her at the ramp. Let us go. She started up the ramp and stopped. The sound came from her left, a child's voice, high and thin and carrying the panic that does not know the language but is perfectly comprehensible in any of them. She turned. The man was perhaps 40 years old, one of Farid Nasri's fighters who had been on the perimeter with them. He was carrying a small girl, 7 years old perhaps. The front of her clothing was dark with blood that was not from a surface wound, not from the positioning of it, not from the way she was holding herself. She was small and pale in the moonlight, and her eyes were open but not quite focused on anything in the present. The man was screaming something in Pashto and looking at the helicopter and looking at his daughter and looking at Kara. She knew the wound without examining it. Abdominal penetration, shrapnel or a round fragment entering at a low angle, damaging things that could not be damaged for long without intervention. The kind of wound that has a timeline, and the timeline was not generous. She stood on the ramp of the Chinook with 1 foot inside it and 1 foot on the ground of the village of Karan and looked at the girl, at Driscoll, at the helicopter, at the girl. Go without me, she said. Driscoll's face did something she would have needed more time to characterize than she had available. Halt. She dies in 5 minutes without intervention, maybe less. Kara stepped off the ramp. Get Wren and Prentice to surgery. I will catch the next bird. There may not be a next bird. Then there may not be a next bird. She was already moving toward the girl, her kit already open. Go, Commander. She heard Driscoll's voice behind her calling names, making decisions. 2 SEALs. Sullivan and Reeves. She heard them acknowledge. She heard the Chinook's pitch change as it began to prepare for departure. She was already on her knees in the dirt beside the small girl, her hands moving with the focus that comes when everything else has been removed from consideration, and there is only the work and the person the work is for. The Chinook lifted off. The rotor wash swept across her, lifting dust from the ground and pulling at her hair and her clothing, and then it was climbing, and then the sound of it was moving away to the south, and then it was a sound in the distance, and then it was nothing. Kara looked at the girl. The girl looked at her with eyes that were trying to focus and not quite managing it. Her father said something in Pashto. One word. Repeated. Farid Nasri appeared beside her, crouching on his old knees in the dust, and spoke in the broken English he had been using since they arrived. Her name, he said, is Layla. Kara's hand stopped moving for exactly 1 second. 1 second. She had heard that name once before in circumstances she had never been able to put far enough behind her. She had carried that name the way she carried the weight in her right leg, the way she carried the image of the small shoe in the rubble of Helmand province. She had carried it like a sentence. Now it was in front of her again. Not a ghost, not a memory. A living child with a name and a wound and a father and a future that was currently a question. She thought about what Ren had said to her in the dark beside the burning helicopter before any of this had begun. Broken things can still cut. Her hands began to move again. She worked. The wound was worse than she had hoped and better than she had feared, which was the narrow margin she had to work with. Entry point left lower quadrant. The fragment had traveled at a shallow angle and had likely stayed in the abdominal cavity. The bleeding was serious but not catastrophic. Layla's pressure was low and dropping, but dropping at a rate that gave Kara something to work with. Minutes, not seconds. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze and applied pressure with both hands and spoke to the girl in a low voice, not in Pashto, which she did not have, but in the tone that crosses languages, because it is not really made of words. The tone that says, I am here and I am not leaving, and the next few minutes are going to be difficult, but we are going to get through them together. Layla's father knelt on the other side of his daughter and held her hand and did not look away from her face. A parent whose whole world had contracted to one point. Sullivan moved them into the village to the stone building with the thickest walls, the same room she had used for Prentice. She got Layla positioned on the sleeping mat and assessed the wound again in the lamplight. The girl's eyes were more focused now than they had been in the clearing. Not all the way focused, but enough. The kind of focus that means the person is present and paying attention to what is in front of them with the resources they have available. What was in front of her was Kara. Kara looked back at her. She thought about the other Layla, the one she had never been able to put a complete face to because the images she carried from Helmand province were fragmented, the way traumatic memory is fragmented, intense in some details and absent in others. What she had was a shoe small and ordinary lying in the rubble of a wall that should not have been a wall anymore, and a sound she could not describe to anyone who had not heard it. And the weight of something the investigation had called unavoidable, and she had called her fault and had been carrying as her fault for 3 years. She was not carrying it the same way tonight. She was still the person who had made a decision over Helmand province in 2009. She was also the person who was keeping this child alive. Both of those things were true at the same time. She was beginning cautiously to understand that both of them could be true at the same time. Broken things can still cut, she said quietly, not to herself, to Layla, who could not understand the words, but who held her gaze with the steadiness of a child who understands that something important is being said even if the language is wrong. Layla's father looked up from across his daughter. Kara met his eyes and nodded once. She kept her hands on the wound. She kept working. Sullivan appeared at her shoulder between trips to the perimeter. QRF is 30 minutes out, maybe less. Maybe less is the part I need. The firefight continued outside in the rhythm of an engagement finding its shape. The SEALs and Farid Nasri's men held the walls. Reeves took a scalp wound and came to Kara and went back out in 90 seconds. Sullivan took a through and through to the left shoulder, managed it himself, reported to Kara, accepted her confirmation that he was functional, and returned to his position without argument. 22 minutes after the Chinook left, the quality of the firefight changed. She heard it before she understood it. The rhythm shifted. The fire from the northern position, which had been sustained and organized, became something else. Reactive. Responsive. The fire of people who are no longer attacking and have begun defending. And then beneath that, another sound fell before it was heard low and heavy and moving, the sound of large rotors in the dark. Sullivan's voice from outside. QRF. The QRF is here. And then the night opened up with the sound and light of attack, helicopters making their presence known, the chain guns producing their characteristic tearing sound that she had heard before from the inside of an Apache cockpit, and that sounded entirely different and entirely wonderful from the inside of a stone building. The heavy beat of the Chinook's rotors was unmistakable. It came from the south. Its landing lights off, but its presence undeniable, the way very large things in the dark are undeniable. Sullivan appeared in the doorway. It is ours. They are coming down in the field south of the village. We need to move. Farid Nasri was already in the room. He spoke briefly to his two men who positioned themselves at Layla's sides and prepared to lift with the careful coordination of people who understood what they were carrying. Kara kept both hands on the wound as they carried her, walking alongside with focus so complete that the night around her reduced itself to the wound under her hands and the breathing of the child and the ground under her feet. They made the 30 meters of open ground to the Chinook's position. The American medics reached them halfway there. Kara gave report in the compressed, precise language that field medicine uses because it has learned over a long time that precision saves lives, that imprecision loses. Abdominal penetration, hemostatic packing. In place, pressure, maintain vitals, trending stabilized but fragile estimated blood loss. Time of injury interventions performed. The medic receiving the report was young and competent and asked one clarifying question and then took over with the smooth handoff that happens when two people who know what they are doing meet in the middle of an emergency. Layla went up the ramp. Her father went with her. Fareed Nasri hesitated at the base of the ramp. He looked back at the village at the burning corner where an RPG had found a building that had been standing since his grandfather was young. At the walls still standing in the moonlight, low and pale and ancient. 3 generations of his family had built in that place. The stone of it was the stone of his life. Kara walked back to him. "Come," she said. "You come with us. Your family, all of them. You come now." He looked at the village again, at the burning corner, at the walls that were still standing. "This is my home," he said, not arguing, stating a fact that required acknowledgement even in the middle of everything. "I know." She did not minimize it because minimizing it would have been a lie, and he would have known it was a lie, and she had enough respect for him to refuse to offer him that particular comfort. "I know what it is, and I know what it will be if you stay in it alone tonight." He was quiet for 5 seconds. He looked at the ramp, at his village, at Kara. He nodded once. The kind of nod that is also a decision and a grieving and an acceptance, all compressed into a single movement. He turned and spoke to his men, who spoke to their families, and the process of gathering people who are leaving a place they did not intend to leave began. Fareed Nasri's family came out of the village carrying what they could carry. His wife, a young woman with a child on her hip. 2 older boys who moved with the awareness of young men who have grown up in a place where awareness is survival. They went up the ramp. Kara was last. She stopped at the base of the ramp and turned once more to look back at the village of Quran. The burning corner was still burning. The walls were still standing. The moonlight was still doing the same thing to the flat mud brick rooftops that it had been doing when she first saw them from the cockpit of the dying helicopter, making them pale and horizontal against the dark of the mountains. She turned and walked up the ramp. The Chinook lifted before the ramp was fully raised. She sat against the interior wall with Sullivan on one side and let the sound of the rotors and the motion of the aircraft work on her, the way that motion and sound work on a body that has been operating at the outermost edge of its capacity for several hours. Not sleep. More like the body acknowledging that the acute part of the situation has resolved and beginning the process of accounting for everything it has spent. Her hands were in her lap. They were still. She looked at them for a moment, at the dried blood on the backs of them, and at the steadiness of them, and thought about the last time she had looked at her hands after something significant and found them shaking, which had been in a hospital bed in Germany in 2009, and about the difference between those hands and these hands and what that difference meant. Across the aircraft, Fareed Nasri sat with his wife beside him, her hand in his. He was doing the thing that people do when they have left a place and are traveling toward an uncertain destination, and the mind is working through what has been exchanged for what. The young Layla on a litter near the front of the aircraft with 2 medics attending her was breathing with the steady, reliable rhythm of a person who has come back from the edge of something and is now in the process of coming back from it. One of the medics caught Kara's eye and gave her a small nod, the kind that means she is going to be all right. Kara looked back at her hands. She was still looking at them when Sullivan said without preamble in the low voice he used when he was saying something he had thought about before saying, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "Ren told you broken things can still cut, right before we took off the first time." "I remember. I have known Marcus Wren for 6 years. I have heard him say maybe 4 things that were not operationally necessary." He paused. That was one of the 4. She did not respond immediately. There was not a response that felt proportionate. "He is going to be fine," she said finally. "The ribs will heal." "Yeah." Sullivan adjusted his wrapped shoulder with a careful movement. "That is not actually what I meant." She knew what he meant. She let it sit. The Chinook descended toward forward operating base Salerno, 41 minutes after lifting from the village of Quran, and the sun was beginning to suggest itself on the eastern horizon, when the skids touched down on the landing pad. Not the full sunrise yet, but the preliminary negotiation between night and morning, the sky in the east going from black to a deep blue that was not quite dark and not quite light. The specific color of the sky at the moment when it has decided what direction it is going. Medical personnel were at the aircraft before the ramp was fully down. Layla went first, moving fast on her litter, her father beside her. The paperwork for Fareed Nasri's family's protected status had been initiated during the flight. Driscoll had seen to it on the radio, while the rest of them were looking at the sky and breathing. It was not a small thing to arrange, and it would take weeks to complete, but the decision had been made, and the decision was what mattered. Fareed Nasri and his wife and his daughter-in-law and his grandchildren were going to Virginia. They were going to live in a country that did not know their names yet, and they were going to find out, as people who have survived enough difficult things sometimes do, find out that beginning again is not the same as losing what came before. Ren was already in surgery. He had gone directly from the first Chinook. Prentice had been stabilized and was being prepared for transport to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, which was where serious head injuries went when field medicine had done everything field medicine could do. He had a good chance. The neurosurgeon at Landstuhl was one of the best. Driscoll found Kara on the edge of the landing pad. She was standing still, which was unusual. She had not been still for 6 hours, and the stillness felt strange in her body, like a vehicle that has been running hard and is now idling and can hear sounds it could not hear before because of the noise. He stood beside her and did not speak immediately. Silence for Driscoll was not something used to avoid things, but to approach them correctly. "I have 3 things to say to you," he said. She waited. "First, you disobeyed a direct order when you stayed behind on that ramp." "Yes, sir." "Second, you put Sullivan and Reeves at risk by forcing them to remain." "Yes, sir." Third was always the one that mattered. "Third," he said, and the quality of his voice had changed in the way that voices change when a person is abandoning the register of command for the register of honesty. "That was the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen. In 21 years of doing this, and I have seen things." She did not know what to say. "You flew 2 aircraft that the manufacturers would have told you were incapable of flight. You landed them both. You stayed behind for a child you did not know in a situation where leaving was the rational choice. And through every single minute of that, you functioned." He paused. "That is not a medic. That is not even just a pilot. I am not sure I have the right word for it." "I was just doing the next thing," she said. "Whatever the next thing was." That is exactly what it is. And it is much rarer than it sounds. The sun came over the eastern ridge in the way that the sun in Afghanistan comes over ridges in October, sudden and clear and surprisingly warm, the light arriving all at once and committing fully to the day. She felt it on her face and closed her eyes for a moment and let it be there. Then she opened them. "You mentioned a proposition," she said. "I did." Driscoll looked at the flight line for a moment, at the aircraft on this hard stand in the growing light, then back at her. "SEAL teams operate in environments where everything can fail simultaneously. We plan for it. We train for it. We carry contingencies inside our contingencies. But there is one gap we have never adequately filled." He paused. "What happens when the pilots are gone and the aircraft is still flyable and the mission is still necessary?" She waited. "Last night you flew 2 aircraft that should not have left the ground. You landed them both in conditions that no training syllabus would have prepared you for. You made decisions under pressure that I would not have second-guessed if an experienced pilot with current certifications had made them." He turned to face her fully. "I am requesting your transfer to SEAL Team 6. Not as a medic, as our emergency aviation specialist. You maintain your medical certification, you participate in all relevant mission planning, and when the pilots are down and the aircraft is still talking, you are the person who gets in the seat." She was quiet. "Your certifications are technically lapsed but not revoked. I have already spoken to the aviation detachment commander. He reviewed your flight records from 2007 to 2009 and your performance from last night and used the word exceptional twice in the same sentence." Driscoll's voice did not change. "The question is not whether you are qualified. The question is whether you are ready to accept that you never stopped being a pilot. You just stopped flying." There it was. The sentence she had not known she needed to hear from someone other than herself. Had not known she needed at all until it was said in a clear voice on a flight line in the early morning by a man who had been watching her for 6 hours and had reached a conclusion she had not permitted herself to reach for 3 years. She looked at the horizon, at the light that was building there. "I will need to recertify," she said. "We have a plan for that. And I keep the medical role." "You keep the medical role." She was quiet for another moment, not hesitating, something more like honoring the weight of the decision by giving it a full breath before making it. Yes, she said. Driscoll nodded once, the nod of a man who had expected the answer and was satisfied by it anyway. Welcome to the team, Warrant Officer Holt. She felt the words settle, warrant officer. Not medic, not former pilot, not the woman who crashed in Helmand, not the woman who had been hiding in a support role for 3 years because it felt like the appropriate penance for a decision the universe had already ruled on. Just a pilot, again. 6 months later, the letter arrived. She was at NAS Oceana in Virginia, which was where SEAL Team 6 staged from when it was in the continental United States, and she had been there for 4 months, settled into a role that did not have a clean precedent in the organizational structures she had previously worked within. Emergency aviation specialist and contingency pilot. The person you called when the flight that needed to happen could not happen any other way. It suited her in a manner that was difficult to articulate but was real. She had logged 47 flight hours in those 4 months. Not all of it in damaged aircraft, some of it in perfectly functional helicopters on routine training flights, relearning the ordinary version of the things she had been doing, the extraordinary version of, in October. And she had discovered that the ordinary version was also something she loved. That the thing she had buried in Helmand Province was not only the capacity for crisis flight, but the simple daily pleasure of being in the air of the specific relationship between a pilot and an aircraft that her father had described to her on a September morning when she was 17 years old. She had not spoken to her father since she took the assignment. She had meant to call. She had composed the call in her head several times, considered what she would say and how she would begin, and whether she would tell him everything or only the broad outlines. She had not made the call, not because she was avoiding it, but because she had not yet found the version of it that felt honest enough. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Not email, a letter, handwritten, on plain white paper in the particular handwriting of a man who had learned to write in an era when handwriting was considered a skill worth developing. Careful, slightly formal, each letter fully formed. She recognized her father's handwriting from across the room. She sat down at the small desk in her quarters and opened it. He had heard about the mission the way people in military communities hear about things through channels that are both informal and reliable. A conversation with someone who knew someone who had been at Bagram when the after-action reporting came through. He did not have the details. He had enough. He began by saying that he did not know how to write this letter and had been trying to write it for several weeks and had decided that the inability to write it perfectly was not a sufficient reason to not write it at all. He said that in February of 1991, on the 4th day of the ground war in Kuwait, he had made a decision that cost a man his life. Not a wrong decision necessarily, not one that a review board would have faulted, but a decision made in 3 seconds over terrain. He did not know well enough a choice about routing that sent his flight of 2 F-16s over a position he had not adequately confirmed, and the aircraft on his wing had taken a shoulder-fired missile that the pilot had not survived. He had told no one, not her mother, not her. Not the chaplain he had spoken to in the days immediately after, who had told him things that were true, but that he had not been ready to hear. He had carried it. For 21 years he had carried it, and he had watched her become a pilot and had been proud in the way that parents are proud when a child enters something the parent loves, and he had also been afraid in the way that parents are afraid when a child enters something dangerous. And when she crashed in Helmand Province and transferred out of aviation, he had said nothing because he had not known how. He had not known how because he had not yet figured out for himself the thing he was trying to tell her. She had figured it out before him. He wrote that the decisions made in 3 seconds over broken terrain in bad conditions are not always wrong because they end badly, and they are not always right because they end well. And the measure of a person is not the outcome of those decisions, but the willingness to stand in the place where those decisions are required and to make them with the best that you have, and then to keep going. He wrote that he had spent 21 years believing the opposite of this, and it had cost him things he had not fully accounted for in himself and in his relationships and in the life he had lived while believing the wrong thing. He wrote that he was 66 years old, and that was old enough to have accumulated enough regrets to know which ones were real and which ones were the mind's way of punishing itself for being human. He wrote that she had never stopped being a pilot. And then at the bottom of the page in handwriting that was slightly less careful than the rest, as if the pen had moved faster there, as if he had written it before he could reconsider it. He wrote the phrase that she did not know he knew. That she had not told him that he had arrived at independently in the same way that people separated by distance and silence and years sometimes arrive at the same truth because it is a truth, and truths have a way of being findable. He wrote, "Broken things can still cut, Kara. You proved that. I am sorry it took me this long to say so." She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Not a long time of grief, or not only that. A long time of something more complicated and less painful than grief. The kind of time you spend with something true that has been true for a long while and is only now being recognized as such. The way you spend time with a view that was always there behind a wall and is now in front of you for the first time. She folded the letter. She put it in the left breast pocket of her flight suit, where she had a habit of keeping things that needed to remain accessible. Not buried, not behind her. Accessible. Something to carry forward rather than something to be carried by. She stood up. The morning at NS Oceana in March was cold and clear, in the way that Virginia mornings are cold and clear in early spring, the kind of cold that is still winter in its temperature and already spring in its quality of light. From the windows of the quarters building, she could see the flight line, the aircraft on the hard stand, the activity of a military airfield at the beginning of a working day. She went outside. Ren was already on the flight line. 6 months of recovery had returned most of what the fractured ribs had taken from him, and he stood with the upright bearing of a man who had decided that posture was non-negotiable, regardless of what the last 6 months had done to the musculature behind it. He had a cup of coffee. He was watching the morning training flights with the attention of a man who has spent enough time in aircraft to never be fully indifferent to them. He heard her coming, turned. She was in her flight suit, the one with the name tape that said Holt and the wings above the left breast pocket that had been there since Fort Rucker and had stayed there through everything, through Helmand in Germany and the 3 years in medicine and the night in the Kunar Valley and the 6 months since. The wings that had never been formally removed because the person they belonged to had never formally stopped being a pilot, had only stopped believing she was one. Ren looked at her, at the wings, at the flight suit, at the warrant officer insignia on the collar. He raised his coffee cup once. Then he said it, quietly, not loudly, not dramatically. The way things are said when they carry enough weight, that volume is irrelevant. "Welcome back, Holt." 2 words. She had heard longer speeches about smaller things. "Thank you, Senior Chief," she said. He nodded and turned back to the flight line. She moved to her aircraft, the Black Hawk that had been assigned to her name and her billet, and she ran her hand along the fuselage the way her father had first shown her, and then she climbed into the pilot's seat and put her hands on the controls and sat for a moment in the quiet. The aircraft spoke to her, as they always did, in the language that has no words and requires only the willingness to be still enough to hear it. She heard it. She ran through the pre-flight checks with the full attention she had been giving pre-flight checks for 11 years because the discipline of checking is the foundation of everything that follows, and she had not come this far by abandoning foundations. The engines answered cleanly. The rotor turned. The aircraft came alive beneath her. She thought about a letter in her breast pocket, about her father at a desk in Virginia writing by hand on a Tuesday night because some things are better said slowly. About a man named Marcus Wren who had looked at a woman broken by 3 years of self-imposed sentence and had seen something she had stopped seeing in herself. About a girl named Layla who was by now somewhere in Virginia in school learning things, growing, living the particular ordinary life that had been worth staying behind for. About the Kunar Valley on a clear October morning. About the aircraft that had not wanted to fly and had flown anyway. About the pilot who had not wanted to fly and had flown anyway. She keyed the radio, got her clearance, standard language, standard morning, the unremarkable procedural exchange of a pilot preparing to do the thing she was made to do. She pulled the collective. The Black Hawk lifted from the tarmac at NAS Oceana, Virginia, and the shadow of it swept across the flight line. And the Chesapeake lay ahead in the March light, flat and silver and enormous, and the sky above was the particular blue that belongs to mornings that have decided to be uncomplicated. She climbed. Below her, Wren watched the aircraft rise. He finished his coffee. He did not wave. He simply watched until the Black Hawk had become a shape in the middle distance, and then until the shape had become a sound, and then until the sound had become part of the general morning. Then he went back inside to do his work, and Kara Holt flew north over the Chesapeake, her hands easy on the controls, the aircraft speaking to her in the language she had always known, the letter in her pocket, the wings on her chest, the sky ahead of her, vast and open, and asking nothing of her except that she be exactly what she had always been. A pilot. Home.